Welcome. Thank you for being here, whether you're settling in for the night or simply looking for something calm to accompany your evening. Tonight, we're going to explore a quiet corner of history, one that's often overlooked but absolutely essential to understanding how people lived in cities centuries ago. It's a story about work done in darkness, about problems solved in the hours when most of the world was sleeping. It's the story of the Gong farmers and how their labor shaped urban life itself. So get comfortable, let yourself relax, and let's step back together into a world that existed long before our own. To understand why they existed at all, we need to step back and imagine what it meant to live in a medieval city. Picture narrow streets, houses pressed close together, timber and stone buildings rising 2, 3, sometimes 4 stories high. And beneath many of these buildings, dug deep into the earth, were pits, cesspits. Every household had one or shared one with neighbors. It was simply how things were done. These pits were not sealed chambers. Medieval builders designed them with porous walls, stone or brick, laid in such a way that liquid could seep away into the surrounding soil. It seemed practical at the time. The liquid waste would drain naturally through the earth, leaving behind the solid matter to accumulate more slowly. In theory, this meant the pit wouldn't fill quite so quickly. But of course it did. Perhaps not in a year, perhaps not in 2, but every few years, sometimes sooner if the household was large, the pit would reach its capacity. And when that happened, there was only one solution. Someone had to go down into that darkness and remove everything by hand, bucket by bucket, shovel by shovel. There was no other way. This was the reality that shaped urban life for centuries. The waste didn't simply disappear. It accumulated in the literal foundations of people's homes, beneath the places where they cooked and slept and raised their children. And every household, from the humblest cottage to the finest merchant's house, faced the same inevitable problem. The consequences of neglecting this task were never abstract. They were immediate and tangible. Poor sanitation wasn't just unpleasant, it was a threat to survival itself. The water that families drew from wells could become contaminated if waste seeped too close. The very ground beneath a city's streets held countless cesspits, all slowly filling, all potentially leaking into the water table that everyone depended upon. Imagine living in a house where the floorboards began to sag, where there was a certain smell that wouldn't go away no matter how much lavender or rosemary you scattered. These were signs that the pit below had overfilled, that the earth could no longer absorb what was being asked of it. In the worst cases, floors could actually collapse, giving way into the cesspit below. It happened. People knew it happened, and so they watched for the signs and called for help before disaster struck. This wasn't only about individual households, though. As cities grew, the problem multiplied. Thousands of cesspits, all filling at different rates, all requiring attention. Without a system for managing this waste, without people dedicated to its removal, urban life would have become impossible. Disease would have spread unchecked. Water supplies would have failed. The great cities of the medieval world, London, Paris, York, Norwich, all of them depended on an invisible network of waste management that most people preferred not to think about. But someone had to think about it. City authorities certainly did. They created regulations, strict rules about where waste could and could not go. You couldn't simply dump the contents of a cesspit anywhere you pleased. That would have led to chaos, to contamination spreading through the streets, to rivers becoming open sewers even more than they already were. And so designated areas were established. They were called lay stalls, official dumping grounds where night soil could be deposited, at least temporarily. Some were on the outskirts of the city, others were closer in areas already considered less desirable. The regulations were clear. Waste must go to the lay stalls or to other approved locations, nowhere else. Along rivers, there were particular spots where barges could unload. In London, there was even a place called Dung Wharf. The name was straightforward, functional. This was where boats arrived in the darkness, carrying their loads of human waste collected from throughout the city. Night after night, the barges came, and what they carried was transferred to carts or simply piled for collection. The Thames, much of it received eventually, flowing out to sea, carrying away what the city could not keep. But not all of the waste went into the river. This is where something interesting emerges from this rather grim picture. Farmers wanted it. In the fields surrounding the city, farmers understood something that modern people often forget, that human waste, properly aged and mixed with soil, could make their land more productive. It was valuable. It was, in its way, a resource. So a kind of economy developed. The night soil that was such a problem in the city became a commodity in the countryside. Farmers would pay for cartloads of it, or they would make arrangements with the Gong farmers directly, taking the waste in exchange for a reduced fee. The fields needed feeding, and the city needed emptying, and somehow in this mutual need, a system emerged. This was the world the Gong farmers moved through. They existed at the intersection of urban necessity and agricultural demand. They were the ones who descended into the darkness beneath houses, who filled the carts that rolled through sleeping streets, who knew the locations of every lay stall and every farmer willing to take a load before dawn. Without them, the medieval city would have drowned in its own waste. That's not an exaggeration. It's simply the mathematics of human habitation. When people live together in large numbers in permanent settlements built of stone and wood, the question of waste becomes existential. It must go somewhere. It must be moved, processed, dealt with. Someone must do that work. And so they did. Generation after generation, in cities across Europe and beyond, the Gong farmers pursued their trade. They were essential. They were necessary. They were the reason urban life could continue. In the coming hours, we'll explore their world more deeply. We'll walk through their nights, understand their methods, learn their regulations and their struggles. We'll see how they were regarded, how they were compensated, how their work shaped the very streets and neighborhoods we might still walk through today, centuries later. But for now, it's enough to understand this. Beneath the surface of medieval life, literally beneath the floors and streets, there was a hidden infrastructure of pits and waste and careful management. And moving through that infrastructure, in the hours when most people slept, were workers whose labor made everything else possible. The night soil economy was real. It was complex. It was strangely organized. And that's where our story truly begins.
So, who were these people who moved through the darkness? What were their lives actually like? They had a name, of course, several names in fact. Most commonly, they were called Gong farmers. The word gong comes from an Old English term for a privy or cesspit. But they were also known by another name, perhaps more descriptive of when they worked: nightmen, because their labor happened exclusively in the hours of darkness. This wasn't a preference, it was a requirement. The regulations were specific and strictly enforced. Gong farmers could only work between 9 o'clock in the evening and 5 o'clock in the morning. Those were their hours. The world of daylight, the world of bustling markets and open shop fronts and people going about their daily business, that world was not for them. Not while they were working, at least. The reason was simple, if we're being honest about it. The work was unpleasant. The smell was overwhelming. The sight of men hauling buckets of human waste through the streets was not something polite society wanted to witness. And so the work was pushed into the hours when most people were asleep, when shutters were closed and streets were empty. The city needed this work done, but it didn't want to see it happening. There's something poignant about that, isn't there? The very people who made urban life possible were required to be invisible. Their labor was essential, but it had to remain hidden, conducted in shadow and silence while the rest of the world dreamed. And this invisibility extended beyond their working hours. Many Gong farmers lived on the very edges of town, in areas that most people avoided. Often their homes were downwind from the main settlement, a practical consideration perhaps, given the smells that clung to their clothes and tools. But it also meant physical separation from the community they served. They were close enough to reach the city's cesspits each night, but far enough away that others didn't have to think about them during the day. The stigma ran deep. It wasn't just the individual worker who carried it, it was entire families. Being a Gong farmer meant your wife was also marked by the profession. Your children were known as the children of a nightman, and that designation followed them everywhere. Imagine being a child in such a family. You'd go to play with other children perhaps, and their parents would call them away. You'd hear whispers, see looks. The other children might taunt you, might refuse to include you in their games. Not because of anything you'd done, but because of what your father did when darkness fell, because of how your family smelled, even after washing, because of where you lived and who you were. As these children grew older, the walls around them remained. Other professions were largely closed to them. A Gong farmer's son couldn't easily apprentice to a carpenter or a baker. Who would take him on? Who would want that association? The guilds, those powerful organizations that controlled so many trades, had their standards, their reputations to maintain. The son of a nightman didn't fit. And so, more often than not, the son became what his father was. He inherited the job, not through choice exactly, but through the absence of other options. He learned the trade because it was the trade available to him. He memorized the locations of cesspits, learned which households paid promptly and which delayed, discovered how to work the ropes and pulleys that would define his nights for decades to come. This created a kind of dynasty, though that seems too grand a word for it. Families passed down the profession across generations. A grandfather who worked the pits, a father who did the same, a son who would continue. Skills and knowledge preserved not in written manuals, but in quiet instruction, in nights worked together, in a father showing his boy how to lower the bucket just so, how to breathe through his mouth, how to tie the knots that would hold. For daughters in these families, the future was equally constrained. Marriage outside the profession was rare. What family would want their son to marry a Gong farmer's daughter? The stigma was too strong, the social divide too wide. And so daughters typically married within their own circle, other outcasts, people whose work also marked them as separate from respectable society. Skinners, for instance, men who worked with dead animals, who flayed hides and dealt with blood and rot, they too lived on the margins, both literally and socially. Their work was necessary. Leather was needed for boots, for saddles, for countless essential items. But like the Gong farmers, they were kept at a distance. A marriage between a Gong farmer's daughter and a Skinner's son made a certain kind of sense. They understood each other's worlds. They shared the experience of being necessary but unwanted. Over time, in some places, entire small communities formed from these outcasts. A cluster of houses at the edge of town where the Gong farmers lived alongside the Skinners, the Tanners, the Knackers, all those whose work involved smells and substances that polite society couldn't bear. They had their own social networks, their own rhythms of life. Children played together, families intermarried, knowledge and skills circulated within the group. In some ways, there might have been comfort in this, a sense of belonging, even if it was belonging among the excluded. No one in these communities looked down on you for your profession because they understood. They did similar work or married someone who did. There was no pretense, no need to hide what you were. But it was still isolation. It was still being kept separate from the larger society, from the prosperity and opportunities available to others. A Gong farmer might be essential to the city's survival, but he would never be welcomed into its heart. His children might grow up strong and capable, but doors would remain closed to them. His family might be honest and hard-working, but they would always be regarded as something apart, something less. This was the social reality of the profession. The work itself was hard enough, descending into filth, hauling waste through the night, breathing air that burned your throat and clung to your lungs. But perhaps equally difficult was the knowledge that you were marked by it, that your children were marked by it, that the mark would likely persist across generations. Yet they did the work, night after night, year after year, generation after generation. They descended into the cesspits and came back up again. They loaded the carts and drove them through sleeping streets. They knew every lay stall, every approved dumping ground, every farmer who would take a load before dawn. They were nightmen. They were Gong farmers. They were the people who lived in the shadows of medieval society, doing work that everyone depended on and no one wanted to acknowledge. Their lives were constrained by stigma and regulation, by where they could live and when they could work and who their children could become. But they were also the reason the city didn't collapse under the weight of its own waste. They were the essential workers of their age, even if their age didn't want to call them that. In the hours ahead, we'll follow them more closely through their actual work, the tools they used, the methods they developed, the dangers they faced. We'll see how they navigated regulations and authorities, how they earned their living from this most difficult of trades. But for now, we've met them. We understand something of their world. We know that behind the simple term Gong farmer were real families, real children, real lives shaped by necessity and stigma in equal measure. They were hidden in darkness, but their work was foundational. And that tension between invisibility and importance defines their entire story.
In most professions during the medieval period, there was a formal structure for learning. A boy would be apprenticed to a master craftsman, bound by contract for 7 years, sometimes longer. The guilds oversaw this process, ensuring standards were maintained, that skills were properly taught, that the next generation would be worthy of the trade. There were ceremonies sometimes, and definitely documentation. A boy's apprenticeship was recorded, official, recognized, but not for Gong farmers. The guilds, those powerful organizations that controlled everything from baking to goldsmithing, they wanted nothing to do with this profession. Gong farmers were barred entirely. There would be no official apprenticeships, no guild oversight, no formal recognition of skills learned and mastered. The work was too stigmatized, too far outside the boundaries of respectable trade. And so the knowledge passed differently, quietly, secretly almost, from father to son, in the darkness, through demonstration and careful observation. A boy might be 10 years old, perhaps 12, when he first began to learn seriously. Young by our standards, but this was a world where children worked, where they were expected to contribute to the family's survival. And for a Gong farmer's son, there was really only one trade available. The teaching began not in the cesspits themselves, but in watching. The father would bring his son along on jobs, have him stand at the top of the pit while the work happened below. Watch, he'd say, pay attention, learn the rhythm of it. And the boy would watch. He'd see how his father tested the rope before trusting it with weight, how he'd pause at the edge of the pit, letting his eyes adjust to the deeper darkness below, how he'd descend carefully, never rushing, always keeping 3 points of contact, how he'd position the bucket, how he'd fill it without splashing, how he'd signal when it was ready to be hauled up. These weren't things you could learn from a book. There were no books about this work. No one wrote treatises on the proper technique for emptying a cesspit. The knowledge existed only in the bodies and minds of the men who did it, and it passed through observation, through repetition, through a boy standing in the cold night air, watching his father disappear into darkness again and again. Physical build mattered in ways that might seem strange. In many trades, size and strength were advantages. A blacksmith wanted broad shoulders and powerful arms. A mason needed the ability to haul heavy stones. But for a Gong farmer, particularly for the ones who had to navigate the narrow access points into cesspits, a slim build was actually prized. Many cesspits could only be accessed through chutes barely wider than a man's shoulders. Some were even narrower, designed more for the waist going down than for anyone going in. A slender boy could slip through openings that would trap a larger man. And so fathers with slim sons might feel a certain relief, knowing the boy's build suited the work, even if the work itself was nothing any parent would wish for their child. When the boy was finally ready to descend himself, the first tasks were usually the smallest ones, scraping mostly. The walls of a cesspit would accumulate hardened waste over time, material that had dried and stuck fast to the stone or brick. Before the main excavation could happen, someone needed to scrape those walls clean, loosening the material so it would fall and could be scooped into buckets. This was the boy's job. Armed with a scraping tool, sometimes just a flat piece of wood or metal, he'd work his way around the pit's interior, loosening the accumulated filth. It was unpleasant work, certainly, but it was also relatively safe. He was learning the environment, understanding how the space felt, how sound echoed differently in pits of different sizes, how to read the texture of the walls. Clearing the chutes was another early task. These access points could become partially blocked with waste or debris, making descent difficult or dangerous. A young apprentice would be sent down first, his smaller size an advantage, to clear any obstructions before the master descended with the heavier tools. There was responsibility in this, even if the task seemed simple. The master's safety depended on the chute being properly cleared. If the boy missed something, if he left a loose stone or a thick accumulation of material, his father could become stuck, could struggle, could be injured. So the boy learned to be thorough, to check carefully, to take pride in doing this preparatory work well. The real education, though, came in understanding the dangers, because this work was dangerous in ways that weren't always obvious. A mistake in positioning a bucket could cause waste to slosh back into the pit, undoing work already done and extending the job by hours. A rope tied incorrectly could slip under weight, sending tools or buckets crashing down into the darkness. Worse, it could leave a man stranded in the pit with no way to climb out. And then there was the gas. Cesspits could accumulate pockets of noxious air, methane mostly, and other gases produced by decomposition. You couldn't see it. Sometimes you couldn't even smell it over the other overwhelming odors. But it could make you dizzy, confused, sick. In the worst cases, it could render you unconscious. And unconscious at the bottom of a cesspit meant almost certain death. Experienced Gong farmers developed a sense for this danger. They'd lower a candle into the pit before descending. If the flame guttered or went out, they knew the air was bad. They'd wait, sometimes all night, letting the pit ventilate naturally before attempting to work in it. Or they'd find ways to create a draft, stirring the air with cloths on poles, forcing the bad air out and letting fresh air in. This was the kind of knowledge that kept you alive. Not strength, though that helped with the heavy hauling. Not speed, though efficiency mattered for getting the work done during the limited night hours. What mattered most was judgment, understanding, the ability to read a situation and know when to proceed and when to wait. A boy learned this through near misses often, through seeing his father pause at the edge of a pit and say, "No, not tonight, the air's not right," through feeling suddenly lightheaded himself and being pulled up quickly, learning what those first warning signs felt like in his own body, through hearing stories, and there were always stories, of men who'd ignored the warnings, who'd descended anyway, who hadn't come back up conscious or at all. There was no safety equipment as we'd understand it, no gas detectors, no breathing apparatus, no harnesses with backup lines. There was rope, and there was experience, and there was knowledge, passed down from men who survived long enough to pass it on. So the apprenticeship, informal as it was, focused on survival as much as technique. A father teaching his son wasn't just showing him how to empty a cesspit, he was teaching him not to die while doing it, how to recognize danger, how to move carefully, how to think 3 steps ahead, always aware that one mistake in this environment could be your last. And the boys learned. They had to. There was no guild to fall back on if they failed, no alternative profession waiting for them. This was their future, for better or worse. So they watched carefully. They listened when their fathers spoke. They practiced the knots until they could tie them in complete darkness. They learned to trust the rope and to check it anyway. They developed the habits that would, with luck, keep them alive for a career of working in places where light barely reached and air itself could be poison. By the time a boy was 15 or 16, he might be working beside his father as something close to an equal. He'd know the work. He'd understand the risks. He'd have his own tools, his own techniques developed through experience. He wouldn't have a guild certificate or formal recognition of his skills, but he'd have something more valuable in this particular trade. He'd have survived long enough to become competent. And eventually, he'd have his own sons, and the cycle would continue. Knowledge passing in the darkness, survival wisdom transmitted through demonstration and warning and the hard teacher of experience itself. This is how the profession persisted, not through formal institutions, but through family bonds and necessary inheritance. Not through pride in the work, how could there be pride when the work meant social exclusion, but through the simple fact that someone had to do it, and if your father did it, you likely would too. The next generation learned. They descended into the darkness just as their fathers had. They scraped the walls and cleared the chutes and hauled the buckets. They learned to read the air and respect the rope and move with careful, deliberate attention. They became, in their turn, the nightmen, the gong farmers, the invisible keepers of urban sanitation. And the medieval city continued, built on their hidden labor, generation after generation. Let's talk about the physical objects that made this work possible. Because for all the skill and knowledge that a gong farmer needed, in the end, the work came down to tools. Simple tools, mostly. Things you could make yourself or purchase from a blacksmith who didn't ask too many questions about what you needed them for. The shovel was essential, but not just any shovel would do. A gong farmer's shovel needed a wide blade, broader than what you'd use for digging in a garden or moving earth. The wide blade could scoop larger quantities with each motion, which mattered when you were working against the clock of darkness, trying to empty an entire cesspit before dawn arrived and your legal working hours ended. These shovels took a beating. The work was hard on tools. The blade would dull against stone walls, would bend slightly from the constant leverage of lifting heavy, wet loads. A Gong farmer might go through several shovels in a year, the metal wearing down until it needed to be replaced or reforged. Then there were the tubs, large wooden vessels, barrel-like, designed to hold 20 to 30 gallons of waste. This was what got lowered into the pit on ropes, what got filled with shovelful after shovelful of muck, what got hauled back up to be emptied into the cart waiting above. Imagine the weight of that. 30 gallons of dense, wet waste, the tub itself already heavy with the thick wood needed to hold that kind of load. And it all had to be lifted straight up, hand over hand through 10 or 15 or 20 feet of vertical space. This is where the real physical labor of the work became apparent. Not in the shoveling, though that was hard enough, but in the hauling, the constant, repetitive act of pulling that weight upward through darkness. The rope was probably the single most important tool. Everything depended on the rope. It had to be strong enough to bear the weight of full tubs, reliable enough to trust with your life when you used it to climb in and out of the pit. Most Gong farmers used hemp rope. It was what was available, what you could afford. Strong stuff when it was new and dry. But rope doesn't stay new. It frays, it weakens with moisture, and it was constantly exposed to moisture in this work, constantly being pulled through waste and filth. So a Gong farmer learned to inspect his rope before every job, running it through his hands in the darkness, feeling for weak spots, for places where the fibers had started to give way. Many knotted their ropes at regular intervals. These knots served multiple purposes. They provided grip, places where your hands could catch and hold when you were hauling up a heavy tub. They also served as a kind of measurement system. You could count the knots as the rope paid out, know roughly how deep the pit was, how much more rope you'd need. For descending into the pit itself, there were ladders. Simple wooden ladders, nothing fancy. They needed to be light enough to move from job to job, but sturdy enough to trust with your weight. 10 feet was common, 20 feet for the deeper pits. Sometimes a Gong farmer might lash 2 ladders together for an especially deep job. These ladders would rest against the pit wall, often at a steep angle given the confined space. Climbing down was slow work. You didn't rush on a ladder slick with moisture in near total darkness, knowing that a fall meant landing in waste at the bottom. And climbing back up, tired from hours of work, your clothes heavy and sodden, required careful attention to each rung. Some Gong farmers, the ones who could afford it or who'd been particularly fortunate in their earnings, had leather aprons. These were prized possessions. Leather provided some protection from the filth, could be wiped clean more easily than cloth, lasted longer. A good leather apron might serve you for years, but most couldn't afford leather. Most made do with what they had, which was usually just their oldest, most worn-out clothes, the garments you couldn't wear in daylight anymore, the ones with holes and stains, the ones that were one step away from being rags anyway. These became work clothes. You wore them until they literally fell apart, until the fabric gave way and disintegrated from the constant exposure to moisture and corrosive waste. There was a certain dirk practicality to this. You couldn't maintain good clothes doing this work. The smell alone would ruin them for any other purpose. So you wore things that were already ruined, that had no other use left in them. And when they finally gave out completely, you found another old shirt, another pair of worn breeches, and those became the new work clothes. One interesting tool was the hook-ended pole, longer than a shovel, with a curved metal hook at the end. This served several purposes. You could use it to dislodge blockages in the pit. Sometimes material would compact into hard masses that needed to be broken up before you could shovel them into the tub. You could use it to probe the depth of waste before descending, getting a sense of what you were dealing with. And sometimes, though not often, You'd use it to fish out valuables. Things got dropped into cesspits occasionally. A coin might slip from someone's pocket while they were using the privy. A ring might fall. Small items, precious to their owners, lost in the darkness below. If a household specifically mentioned that something valuable had been dropped, the gong farmer would search for it, using the hook to carefully shift through the muck, hoping for the lucky find that might earn a bonus. The smell was, of course, overwhelming. There was no way to eliminate it, but there were ways to manage it, at least slightly. Ash was common for this purpose. You'd scatter ash over the load in the cart, and it would dampen the smell somewhat, make the journey to the lay stall or dumping ground a bit more bearable for the men doing the hauling. Lime worked too, when you could get it. It was more expensive than ash, but more effective. A layer of lime over a cartload of night soil would react with the waste, reduce the odor, make the whole operation a bit less noxious. Not pleasant, certainly. Nothing could make this work pleasant, but manageable. For light, there were rush lights or lanterns, small flames carefully protected from drafts. The light they provided was minimal, barely enough to see by, but it was something. It marked the edge of the pit. It let you check your tools, see roughly what you were doing. The candle test we mentioned earlier, lowering a flame to check for bad air, that was about the most sophisticated safety equipment that existed. There were no breathing masks, no protective suits, no gear designed specifically for this kind of work. The technology simply didn't exist, and even if it had, who would have manufactured it for such a small, stigmatized profession? So the gong farmer worked with what he had: his wide shovel and his wooden tub, his length of knotted rope carefully inspected, his ladder carried from job to job, his oldest clothes already past their useful life in any other context. These became work clothes. You wore them until they literally fell apart, until the fabric gave way and disintegrated from the constant exposure to moisture and corrosive waste. There was a certain dark practicality to this. You couldn't maintain good clothes doing this work. The smell alone would ruin them for any other purpose. So you wore things that were already ruined, that had no other use left in them. And when they finally gave out completely, you found another old shirt, another pair of worn breeches, and those became the new work clothes. One interesting tool was the hook-ended pole, longer than a shovel, with a curved metal hook at the end. This served several purposes. You could use it to dislodge blockages in the pit. Sometimes material would compact into hard masses that needed to be broken up before you could shovel them into the tub. You could use it to probe the depth of waste before descending, getting a sense of what you were dealing with. And sometimes, though not often, you'd use it to fish out valuables. Things got dropped into cesspits occasionally. A coin might slip from someone's pocket while they were using the privy. A ring might fall. Small items, precious to their owners, lost in the darkness below. If a household specifically mentioned that something valuable had been dropped, the gong farmer would search for it, using the hook to carefully shift through the muck, hoping for the lucky find that might earn a bonus. The smell was, of course, overwhelming. There was no way to eliminate it, but there were ways to manage it, at least slightly. Ash was common for this purpose. You'd scatter ash over the load in the cart, and it would dampen the smell somewhat, make the journey to the lay stall or dumping ground a bit more bearable for the men doing the hauling. Lime worked too, when you could get it. It was more expensive than ash, but more effective. A layer of lime over a cartload of night soil would react with the waste, reduce the odor, make the whole operation a bit less noxious. Not pleasant, certainly. Nothing could make this work pleasant, but manageable. For light, there were rush lights or lanterns, small flames carefully protected from drafts. The light they provided was minimal, barely enough to see by, but it was something. It marked the edge of the pit. It let you check your tools, see roughly what you were doing. The candle test we mentioned earlier, lowering a flame to check for bad air, that was about the most sophisticated safety equipment that existed. There were no breathing masks, no protective suits, no gear designed specifically for this kind of work. The technology simply...
The sun is setting. Somewhere on the edge of the city, in that area where the Gong farmers live, men are beginning to gather. Not suddenly, not all at once. They drift in gradually as the light fades, emerging from their homes, their day of rest coming to an end. Their night of work is about to begin. There's a staging area of sorts, a yard perhaps, or a wide spot in the road where carts are kept. This is where the preparation happens, where the transition occurs between the ordinary world of daylight and the hidden world of night work. The first task is inspection. The wheels must be checked, axles tested for soundness. A cart breaking down in the middle of the night, loaded with waste, would be a disaster. So they check carefully. They rock each cart slightly, feeling for wobbles, listening for the creak that might indicate a weakness. The ropes get the same careful attention. Each man inspects his own rope, running it through his hands length by length, feeling for frayed sections, for places where the hemp has begun to fail. A weak rope discovered now is an inconvenience. A weak rope discovered when you're depending on it to haul up a full tub, or worse, to climb out of a pit, could be deadly. So they check, they feel, they test the knots. Someone is sharpening shovels. There's a particular sound to this, the rasp of metal against whetstone. It's rhythmic, almost musical in its way. A dull shovel makes the work harder, makes each scoop require more effort. So before the night begins, the blades are sharpened, edges restored to keenness. It's a small thing, but it matters. Over the course of a long night, it matters considerably. As the preparations continue, as tools are readied and carts made sound, some of the men share tobacco. Pipes are filled and lit, passed around. There's a certain ritual quality to this. The tobacco steadies the nerves, gives the hands something to do while minds prepare for what's coming. It's a moment of relative calm before the work begins. They talk, but not much. There's an easiness among them, the comfort of men who've worked together for years, who understand each other's rhythms. A comment about a difficult pit from last week, a mention of a household that paid promptly. Small observations, quietly shared. These men spend their nights together in the darkness. They know each other in ways that daylight friendships rarely achieve. As full darkness arrives, the pace changes slightly. Maps exist in their minds, not on paper. Each man knows his territory, the back alleys and narrow ways where carts can pass, where they can't. They know which streets are watched by officials, which routes allow for quieter passage. They know the locations of every cesspit they're responsible for, memorized not through addresses, but through landmarks, through the mental geography of the nighttime city. Someone mentions checking the rear access to a particular house, the alley that runs behind it, whether it's clear, whether there are obstacles that might complicate bringing the cart close. These details matter. The work is hard enough without having to haul full tubs an extra 50 feet because you didn't scout the approach properly. Pit depths are discussed, remembered. That house near the corner, the pit is deep, maybe 20 feet. You'll need the long ladder, the extra length of rope. That one by the market, shallow, but the chute is narrow. Send the boy down first. This knowledge circulates among the crew, each man adding what he knows, building a collective understanding of the night's work ahead. And then, carried on the evening air, comes a sound. Drums. The signal that marks the transition, the official beginning of their working hours. In some cities, this is how it was announced, the start of what was sometimes called the no-shiting hour. A crude name, perhaps, but descriptive. This was the time when respectable people were expected to be done with their evening necessities, when the privy should be empty, when the Gong farmers could begin their work without disturbing the household. The sound of the drums is somehow both permission and confinement. It grants them the right to work, but it also marks them as separate, as different. Their work begins when others ends. Their hours are not the normal hours. Even the signal that starts their night is distinct, something that applies only to them. With the drums fading, the real work begins. The crew moves toward the first job of the night. They know where they're going. They knew before they gathered, before the preparations began. The route is familiar, memorized. The cart rolls quietly through darkening streets, wheels creaking softly, the men walking alongside or behind. They arrive at the house, approach from the rear as planned. The alley is clear, as expected. The cart is positioned as close to the access point as possible. Every foot saved now is effort saved later. The boys go first. This is their role, part of their training. They carry the smaller tools, the scraping implements. They slip down the chute, that narrow passage that leads from the surface down to the cesspit itself. Their slim builds make them perfect for this preliminary work. In the darkness below, they begin clearing the chute, scraping away any accumulated material that might obstruct passage, checking for loose stones or other hazards. They work by feel as much as by sight, their hands reading the texture of the walls, finding and removing obstacles. Above, the men wait, patient. Rushing this part leads to problems later. When the chute is cleared, when the boy climbs back up and nods his confirmation, the master prepares to descend. But not immediately, not without one more check, one more precaution. He takes an iron rod, a probe essentially, long and straight, and he lowers it into the pit, carefully, feeling for the floor. This tells him the depth, confirms what he thought he knew. It also tells him something about what's down there. If the rod sinks deep into soft waste, he knows it'll be heavy work, all that thick material to shovel out. If it hits something solid quickly, there might be less to remove, or there might be compacted material that will need to be broken up. The probe comes back up. The information is assessed. Adjustments to the plan are made silently, automatically. This is going to take 4 hours, not 3. We'll need more tubs. Send word to have the next site ready earlier than planned. Light is a delicate matter. They have lanterns, rushlights, small sources of flame, but they must be used sparingly, carefully. Too much light, too much flame in an enclosed space where gases can accumulate. This is dangerous. They've all heard the stories of explosions, of flames igniting methane pockets, of men burned or worse. So the lanterns are lit, but positioned thoughtfully, at the mouth of the pit, where they can provide some illumination without being inside the space where bad air might collect. The light they cast is minimal, more suggestion than illumination. Most of the work will happen in near total darkness, with hands reading what eyes cannot see. Everything is ready now. The chute is cleared, the depth is known, the light is positioned, the tools are at hand: shovel, tub, rope, ladder. The cart waits in the alley behind, ready to receive what will be brought up from below. The master checks his rope one last time, not because he doesn't trust the inspection he did earlier, but because checking has become instinct. You check before every descent, every single time. It's the habit that keeps you alive. He positions the ladder in the chute, tests it with his weight, feels it settle against the bottom. Stable, sound. He can trust it. A glance at the sky, still fully dark, hours yet for before dawn. Plenty of time if the pit isn't worse than expected. Around him, the other members of the crew are in their positions. The boy ready to receive the full tubs at the top. Another man prepared to haul on the rope. Everyone knows their role. They've done this countless times before. The master takes a breath. Not to steady himself exactly, He's long past needing courage for the descent. It's more of a transition, a moment to shift mental state from preparation to execution, from the surface world to the work below. And then he begins to descend. One hand on the ladder, one foot finding the first rung, a moment of weight transfer as he commits to the descent. The ladder holds. His foot finds the next rung, and the next. The darkness grows deeper around him as he lowers himself into the earth, into the narrow chute, into the cesspit below. Above, at the surface, the others watch him disappear. They've seen this 1,000 times. They'll see it 1,000 more, but they watch anyway, waiting for the confirmation call that will come from below, the signal that he's down safely and the real work can begin. The night has started. The descent has been made. In a cesspit beneath a medieval house.
Down in the pit, the reality is immediate and inescapable. The man standing at the bottom is waist deep in waste, sometimes deeper. There are pits where the accumulation reaches his chest, his neck even, where he has to shovel from a position that's almost like swimming, his arms working above the surface of the muck while his body is submerged in it. The smell is beyond description. We could try to describe it, but words fail at a certain point. It's thick enough to taste. It fills your lungs with every breath. After the first few minutes, something strange happens. Not that you stop smelling it exactly, but that your mind begins to accept it as the baseline, as normal. It has to. Otherwise, you couldn't function. You couldn't work. He begins to shovel. The technique matters. You start at the edges of the pit, working along the walls first. There's a reason for this. If you start in the center, if you dig down and create a hollow in the middle of the accumulated waste, the sides can collapse inward. And when you're standing in the middle of it, when you are quite literally surrounded by this material, a collapse means being buried. It means waste closing over your head. So you work the edges, you clear along the walls methodically, you reduce the pile gradually, evenly, safely. It's slower this way, but slow and alive is better than fast and buried. Every shovelful is heavy. The waste is dense, waterlogged, thick with solid matter. Lifting it requires real effort, and you're lifting it from a position that offers no leverage, standing deep in the material itself, unable to plant your feet firmly, unable to use your legs the way you normally would. It's all arms and back, over and over, scoop and lift and turn and dump. The tub, that wooden barrel, is positioned nearby. He fills it carefully, placing each shovelful with attention. Splash too much and waste sprays back at you. Miss the tub and you've wasted the effort of the lift. So even exhausted, even in near total darkness, he aims carefully. It takes time to fill a tub, 10 minutes, 15 sometimes, depending on the consistency of the waste, depending on how tired he's getting. But eventually it's full, heavy with 30 gallons of dense material. He can't lift that himself. No one could, not from the bottom of a pit. This is where the coordination begins. This is where the crew working above ground becomes essential. He shouts up, not words usually, just a signal, a particular call that carries through the darkness. Full up, or sometimes just a distinctive whistle. The crew above knows what it means. At the top of the pit, 2 men spring into action, the tubmen. Their role is hauling. They take hold of the rope that's attached to the full tub, and they begin to pull. Hand over hand, the rope moves through their palms, rough hemp fibers sliding against skin. The weight is substantial. 30 gallons of waste is well over 200 pounds, and it has to be lifted straight up, 10 feet, 15 feet, sometimes 20 feet of vertical distance. Their hands take a beating from this work. The rope burns as it slides through their grip, even with the knots providing some purchase, even with technique that distributes the effort. The constant friction wears at their skin. By the end of a long night, their palms are raw, sometimes bleeding. They develop calluses, thick layers of hardened skin, but even calluses have limits. The tub rises through the darkness. The man at the bottom watches it go, tracking its ascent by sound, the creak of the rope, the scrape of the tub against the pit walls as it's guided upward. He's already reaching for his shovel again, already beginning to fill the next tub while this one is still being hauled. At the top, the tub clears the edge of the pit. The tubmen swing it over, guide it to where it can be emptied, usually into barrels, large containers that will eventually be loaded onto the cart. Sometimes, if the cart is positioned close enough, directly into the cart itself. The tub tips. The waste pours out, splashing into the receiving container. Then the empty tub is lowered back down. The rope pays out, the tubman controlling the descent, making sure it doesn't swing too wildly or drop too fast. At the bottom, the man catches it, steadies it, positions it for the next load. And the cycle continues. Fill, signal, haul, empty, lower, fill again. Every 10 to 15 minutes, another tubful comes up. Hour after hour, this rhythm persists. The man below shoveling in near total darkness, standing in filth, working the edges of the pit methodically. The tubmen above hauling rope, their hands growing increasingly raw, the barrels at the surface slowly filling. Outside, in the alley, there's a horse, a handler waiting with the animal and the cart it's harnessed to. He can't see what's happening. The work is around a corner or through a narrow passage, somewhere the cart and horse can't easily go. But he can hear the rhythm of it, the calls, the sounds of tubs being emptied. He knows roughly how much longer it will take. He's patient. The horse is patient. They wait. When the barrels are full, they're rolled or carried to the cart. The handler helps load them. The weight is distributed carefully. Too much on one side, and the cart becomes unstable. These men know how to pack a cart, how to balance the load so it rolls smoothly through the dark streets ahead. Down in the pit, the work continues. The pile is shrinking now. What was waist-deep is becoming knee-deep. What reached his chest now comes to his waist. Progress is being made. He can feel it in his body, can see it in the slightly increased working space around him. But he's tired, hours into the work now. His arms ache, his back protests with every lift. Breathing is labored, partly from exertion, partly from the air quality in the pit, which is never good. He takes brief pauses, leaning on the shovel, letting his heart rate slow slightly before resuming. The danger never entirely leaves. Every moment in the pit carries risk. The rope could fail, a wall could collapse, the air could turn bad suddenly, gases overwhelming him before he realizes what's happening. A simple misstep could turn an ankle, and an injury down here, in this environment, away from any help, that's a serious problem. Even the act of climbing out, when the work is finally done, carries danger. The ladder is slick, your clothes are sodden and heavy, you're exhausted, your hands are tired from gripping the shovel for hours, and you have to climb 15 feet of ladder in near darkness, each rung requiring focus, requiring you to override your fatigue and move carefully. A slip on that ladder, a fall back into the pit, could be fatal. Not from the fall itself necessarily, though that could injure you, but falling back into the waist, possibly injured, possibly disoriented, that could mean drowning in filth. It has happened. The experienced men know it has happened, and so they climb carefully, always, even when exhausted, especially when exhausted. But we're not at the climb out yet. We're still in the middle hours of the work, the steady rhythm of labor, the pit slowly, gradually emptying, the man below shoveling his methodical pattern around the walls, the tubmen above hauling rope, their hands burning, their shoulders aching, the barrels filling, the cart waiting.
There's something almost hypnotic after a while. The same motions repeated endlessly. Shovel, lift, dump. Shovel, lift, dump. Wait for the tub to return. Position it. Resume. The mind can drift during work like this, thinking about other things, remembering daylight, planning for rest that will come when dawn arrives. But you can't drift too far. You have to maintain awareness. Listen to the sound of your shovel hitting the pit wall. It tells you where the edge is in the darkness. Feel the consistency of what you're shoveling. If it suddenly changes texture, that might indicate a problem, material that's hardened and compacted, or worse, structural issues with the pit itself. The tubmen above have their own awareness to maintain. They listen for the signal calls from below. They watch the rope for signs of wear. They coordinate their hauling, finding a rhythm between them that makes the work slightly less exhausting. One pulls while the other repositions. Then they switch back and forth, sharing the burden. It's teamwork, though they might never call it that. It's coordination born from necessity and experience. Each man knows his role. Each man depends on the others. The man below needs the tubman to haul his loads up. The tubmen need him to fill the tubs properly. The horse handler needs them all to maintain the schedule, to keep the work moving so the cart can be loaded and the next job can be reached before their legal working hours end. And slowly, tub by tub, the pit empties. The work continues. The night deepens around them. Somewhere in the city, people are sleeping in their beds, never thinking about the work being done beneath their houses, in the infrastructure that makes their comfortable lives possible. The Gong farmers work on.
We've talked about the work itself, the rhythm and coordination of it, but we need to talk about the dangers too. Because this wasn't just difficult work, it was genuinely perilous. And understanding why requires understanding what lurked in those dark spaces beneath the city. The air itself could kill you. Cesspits produced gases as the waste decomposed, methane primarily, hydrogen sulfide, other compounds with long chemical names that medieval people had no words for. They just knew that sometimes the air went bad. Sometimes a man would descend into a pit and within minutes start to feel dizzy, confused. His movements would slow, his thinking would cloud. And if he stayed down there, if no one pulled him out quickly, he would lose consciousness. And once unconscious at the bottom of a cesspit, well, that was usually the end. The experienced men learned to recognize the early signs. A certain lightness in the head, a feeling like you'd stood up too quickly, your vision narrowing slightly at the edges. These were warnings, your body telling you the air wasn't right, that you needed to get out now. Some developed a technique of breathing, shallow breaths timed with the shovel strokes. You'd breathe in as you lifted, out as you turned and dumped. Never deep breaths, never pulling that air fully into your lungs. It reduced the risk somewhat, gave you a better chance of noticing if things were getting bad before they got critical. But it wasn't foolproof. Nothing was foolproof. The gases could accumulate in pockets, could be stirred up by the very act of shoveling. You might be working in relatively safe air one moment, and the next moment hit a pocket of concentrated methane. By the time you realized something was wrong, you might already be too impaired to climb out on your own. And then there was fire. Remember those lanterns we talked about? The small flames providing minimal light? They were necessary for the work, but they were also dangerous. Methane is flammable, highly flammable. A spark in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong concentration of gas present, and you could have an explosion. It didn't happen often, but it happened. A lantern knocked over in the confined space of a pit, a spark from a metal tool striking stone at just the wrong angle, and suddenly flame filling the space, the methane igniting, pressure building in the confined area. Men were burned, some badly, some fatally. The walls could collapse from the force of it. The wooden structures above could catch fire. So they were careful with flame, sparingly used, positioned thoughtfully, constantly monitored. But careful doesn't mean safe. It just means less dangerous. The risk remained. The structures themselves were another threat. These pits were often old, some of them generations old. The walls, whether stone or brick, could deteriorate. Mortar crumbled, stones shifted, and the ceilings, if there were ceilings, wooden planks or beams supporting the structure above, those could rot. You couldn't always see the rot, not in the darkness, not from below. A beam might look solid, but be degraded inside, its strength compromised. And when that beam failed, when it finally gave way under the weight it was supporting, things could collapse very quickly, without warning. One moment you're working normally, the next moment the ceiling is coming down. There was a man in London in the year 1326. His name was Richard the Raker. We know his name because his death was recorded, documented in the city records. He was working one night, doing his job, down in a cesspit, making his living the only way he knew how. And something went wrong. Maybe the air went bad, maybe he slipped, maybe the structure failed. The records don't specify the exact cause. What they do record is that Richard the Raker drowned in that cesspit, in the very waste he was supposed to be removing. His death wasn't exceptional, it was simply documented. How many others died in similar circumstances without their names being recorded? How many simply disappeared into the darkness and were remembered only by their families, if at all? There's another story, darker in its irony. In Preston, during the Black Death, there was a man, we know him only as John, who somehow survived the plague. While disease swept through the city, while people died in the streets and in their homes, John survived. He made it through one of the deadliest pandemics in human history. And then, afterward, in a moment of terrible irony, he died in his own privy. The structure collapsed, or he slipped, or something else went wrong. The details are lost, but the stark fact remains. He survived the plague, only to die in a cesspit. The men who did this work knew these stories. They knew the names of those who died before them. Richard the Raker, John of Preston, others whose names were passed down in oral tradition, remembered in the community of night workers. These weren't abstract cautionary tales. They were reminders. This could happen to you. This work could kill you. And so they took precautions, not perfect precautions. Perfect safety wasn't possible in this environment, but they did what they could. Some men used rope tethers. You'd tie a rope around your waist before descending, keep it attached while you worked. The other end stayed at the surface, held by someone who was watching, waiting. If you went down and didn't come back up when expected, if you stopped responding to calls, they could pull, could haul you up even if you were unconscious, even if you couldn't climb on your own. It was a simple system, just rope and awareness, but it saved lives. Not every life. Sometimes the gas worked too quickly, or the collapse was too sudden, or the person at the surface wasn't paying close enough attention. But some lives. That was worth the effort of rigging the tether every time. In some pits, if you looked carefully at the walls, you'd find small carved holes, pegs driven into mortar gaps, or stones that had been deliberately shaped to provide handholds. These were escape routes, backup plans. If the ladder failed, if the rope broke, if you needed to get out quickly and the normal method wasn't available, these holds gave you a chance. You could climb the wall itself if you had to. They weren't marked, they weren't official, but the men who worked these pits knew where they were. They'd check them periodically, make sure they were still solid, still usable, just in case the unthinkable happened and you needed to claw your way up the side of a pit wall in the darkness with bad air filling your lungs. Despite all the precautions, despite all the experience and knowledge and care, people still died. Not every shift, not even every year necessarily, but regularly enough that death was simply part of the understood reality of the profession. If you were a gong farmer, you accepted this. You accepted that there was a real possibility you might descend into a pit one night and not come back out, that your family might wait for you at dawn and you wouldn't return, that your name might be added to the list of those remembered in whispered stories, cautionary examples for the next generation. This acceptance wasn't fatalism exactly. It wasn't giving up or not caring. It was more like a pragmatic understanding. This is dangerous work. I'm doing everything I can to stay safe, but sometimes everything you can do isn't enough. And if that happens, well, someone else will take care of my family. Someone else will work this pit tomorrow night. The work continues. There's a certain quiet courage in that, not the dramatic courage of battlefield heroics or daring rescues, but the everyday courage of doing dangerous work because it needs doing, because it's your trade, because your family depends on the income, knowing the risks and descending anyway, night after night, year after year. The dangers shaped how they worked, the techniques they developed, the precautions they took, the awareness they maintained. All of it was a response to the very real possibility of death. They breathed shallowly. They checked their ropes obsessively. They memorized the locations of escape holds. They watched for the signs of bad air. They positioned lanterns carefully. They moved deliberately, never rushed, always aware. And still, sometimes it wasn't enough. Sometimes the danger was just too immediate, too sudden, too overwhelming. A pocket of gas you couldn't have predicted, a structural failure with no warning, a moment of inattention at the wrong time. Richard the Raker probably thought it was a normal night when he descended into that pit in 1326, probably went through his usual preparations, checked his equipment, started his work the way he'd done hundreds of times before. And then something went wrong.
The pit is empty now, or empty enough at least. The work below ground is finished, but the night's labor is far from over, because everything that came up out of that pit now needs to go somewhere, and getting it there is its own careful process. If the cesspit was accessed from inside a house, and many were, the barrels had to be moved through the building itself, through hallways perhaps, past doorways, downstairs. This required care. A spill inside someone's home would be catastrophic. The smell would never come out. The contamination could ruin floors, walls, everything. So the barrels were sealed, lids fitted tightly, sometimes with cloth or rope wrapped around the seal to ensure nothing leaked. The men would test the seal before moving, tipping the barrel slightly, watching for any seepage. Only when they were confident would they begin the careful journey through the house. For smaller quantities, or in situations where barrels wouldn't fit through narrow passages, they used shoulder yokes. You've probably seen pictures of these from other contexts, a wooden bar that rests across your shoulders with buckets hanging from either end. The weight distributes evenly, makes it possible to carry heavy loads through tight spaces. These buckets had to be filled precisely. Too full and they'd slosh with every step, waste slopping over the edges. Not full enough and you were wasting trips, making the work take longer than necessary. The right level, learned through experience, allowed you to move steadily through the house without spillage. Imagine being the householder, lying in bed upstairs, hearing the careful footsteps below, knowing what's being carried through your home,
knowing it's necessary that your cesspit had to be emptied, but still, the sounds in the darkness, the knowledge of what's passing beneath your rooms. Most people preferred not to think about it, preferred to sleep through it if possible, or at least to stay in their chambers until the work was done and the Gong farmers had departed. Outside, in the alley or street, the cart waited, the night cart as it was sometimes called, a sturdy vehicle built to handle weight and rough conditions. The wheels were particularly important, iron-rimmed, wide enough to distribute weight, but not so wide they couldn't navigate narrow alleys. In wet weather, in the mud that medieval streets became after rain, those iron rims would cut through, find purchase, keep the cart moving even when the ground was treacherous. The cart itself would rattle as it moved, a distinctive sound, wood creaking, wheels grinding, the whole structure protesting under its heavy load. People who lived near common routes learned to recognize that sound, the night cart passing. They'd know what it meant, even in their sleep. Loading required attention. The barrels or tubs were heavy, awkward to maneuver. They had to be positioned carefully in the cart bed, arranged to balance the load. Too much weight on one side and the cart could tip, especially when making a tight turn in a narrow alley. And a tipped cart, spilling its contents across a city street, that would be a disaster of the first order. Once loaded, many carts were covered. Canvas stretched across the top, tied down securely. This served multiple purposes. It trapped the worst of the fumes, kept the smell somewhat contained. It also prevented spillage if the cart hit a particularly bad rut or bump. And perhaps importantly, it made the cart slightly less obvious, less visually offensive to anyone who happened to see it passing in the darkness. Even with the canvas cover, the smell was noticeable, impossible to completely contain, so some crews would burn herbs as they traveled. Rue was common for this purpose, a strongly scented herb that medieval people believed had purifying properties, or sometimes feathers, which produced a different kind of smoke, one that somehow cut through the other odors. They'd carry a small brazier on the cart, carefully positioned where it wouldn't be a fire hazard, and keep the herbs or feathers smoldering as they moved through the streets. It didn't eliminate the smell, nothing could do that, but it helped. It created a different scent to mix with the pervasive stench, made the whole thing slightly more bearable for everyone involved. The journey to the dumping ground could be long or short depending on where you were in the city and where you were permitted to dump. The carts moved slowly. You couldn't rush. The streets were too uneven, the load too unstable, the risk of spills too great. So you proceeded at a steady walking pace, the horse or horses pulling steadily, the handler walking alongside or behind, watching the load, watching the route. Sometimes, despite all precautions, a tub would develop a leak. Maybe it had been damaged during the hauling up from the pit. Maybe it had a weak point that only showed itself under the stress of transport. Whatever the cause, you'd notice liquid seeping out, running down the side of the cart. This required an immediate stop. The crew would gather around the leaking tub, assess the damage. If the leak was small, they could patch it right there. A bit of cloth or rope stuffed into the crack, perhaps some tar if they carried it. Anything to stop the leak enough to reach the dumping ground. The patch didn't have to be permanent, it just had to last for the rest of the journey. If the leak was too severe to patch, they'd have to redistribute the load, empty the damaged tub into other containers, leave the broken one behind for repair later. This meant delays, meant arriving at the dumping ground later than planned, meant less time for additional jobs before dawn, but it was necessary. You couldn't just let waste leak out across the streets as you traveled. The dumping grounds varied. Official lay stalls were designated spots, usually on the outskirts of town. Or there were farmers who'd made arrangements to receive night soil, who needed it for their fields. Those destinations were preferable. You were paid for the load, or at least the farmer took it off your hands willingly. You could empty your cart and know the material was going to actual use. By the time the cart arrived at a farmer's land, dawn might be approaching, the sky beginning to lighten at the edges. The farmer would be awake or waking, ready to inspect what you'd brought. And yes, they inspected it. Not all night soil was equal in their eyes. Waste from wealthier households, where diets included more meat and varied foods, was considered better quality. Waste from poorer areas might be less desirable. The farmers had opinions about this, had preferences. They'd look at the load, sometimes poke at it with a stick, assess the quality. If it met their standards, the transaction would proceed. The waste would be dumped in designated spots on the farm to be mixed with straw and other materials to begin the slow process of composting that would eventually make it safe and useful for the fields. If the farmer wasn't satisfied, there might be negotiation, a reduced fee, a grumbled acceptance, or sometimes a refusal. You'd have to find somewhere else to dump this load. At the lay stalls, the process was simpler but less pleasant. These were open dumping grounds, piles of waste accumulating until they could be dealt with, and they attracted scavengers, pigs mostly. The animals would root through the piles, finding whatever organic matter they could digest. It was disgusting to witness, but in a strange way, it was part of the ecosystem of waste management. The pigs broke down the material, reduced the volume, made the piles slightly more manageable. The smell at a lay stall was beyond anything we've described so far. All the individual loads brought through the night, all the accumulated waste from countless cesspits, all of it together in one location. The men who worked this route regularly developed a tolerance, or at least a numbness to it, but it never became pleasant. It couldn't. It was simply endured. The cart would pull up, the load would be dumped, tipped out of the barrels, shoveled from the bed, whatever method worked best. The empty containers would be loaded back on the cart, ready for the next job, or if this was the last load of the night, ready to be taken back to the staging area and cleaned for tomorrow. And here's where the economics of it became clear. What had been a problem in the city, waste that had to be removed, that threatened health and water supplies, became a commodity outside it. Farmers paid for this material, not a lot necessarily, but enough that it had value, enough that it could be sold, traded, negotiated over. By morning, the night soil that had been hauled up from a cesspit in darkness had been transformed from urban waste to agricultural resource. The Gong farmer who'd been standing waist-deep in filth had been paid for his labor. The farmer who'd purchased or received the waste now had fertilizer for his fields. The household whose cesspit had been emptied could use their privy again without worry. The entire cycle created value from refuse. It turned a sanitation problem into an economic transaction. It moved material from where it was harmful to where it could be useful. And it happened night after night, cart after cart, load after load. The sun would be rising now, the legal working hours for the Gong farmers coming to an end. The carts would be making their way back to the edges of town, to the areas where the night workers lived. The horses would be unhitched, fed, watered, the equipment would be checked, cleaned as much as possible, prepared for the next night. And the men would head to their homes, would strip. Here's where the story takes an interesting turn. Because for all the stigma, for all the social exclusion and danger and difficulty of the work, the Gong farmers were paid reasonably well, sometimes very well. A typical night's work might earn a Gong farmer 6 pence. That might not sound like much to modern ears, but let's put it in context. In a time when a laborer might earn 2 or 3 pence for a full day's work in sunlight, earning 6 pence for a night's labor was significant. It was compensation that reflected the difficulty and unpleasantness of the task. Some were paid by the ton instead, 2 shillings per ton of waste removed. This could add up quickly on large jobs. A deep cesspit that hadn't been emptied in years might yield several tons. A Gong farmer who worked efficiently, who took on multiple jobs in a night, could earn more than a carpenter, more than many skilled tradesmen who worked in respectable professions. There's a paradox in this. The work was stigmatized. The workers were outcasts, but they were paid better than people who were socially accepted, who could walk through the city in daylight without shame. Money and status didn't align the way you might expect. Payment came in different forms depending on who was hiring. Private households usually paid in coin, pennies, sixpence, shillings, depending on the job. But institutions had their own arrangements. Churches, for instance, often paid in beeswax candles. This seems strange until you remember that beeswax candles were valuable commodities. They burned cleaner and longer than tallow. They could be traded or sold. For a gong farmer, receiving payment in candles was perfectly acceptable. They had value, could be converted to other goods or coin as needed. There's even a record from the time of Elizabeth I. The Queen herself had gong farmers who maintained the palaces and royal properties. These workers received brandy as part of their compensation. Whether this was a perk or a necessity, something to steady the nerves before descending into a royal cesspit, we can only speculate, but it speaks to the various forms that payment could take. Over time, particularly for gong farmers who were efficient and reliable, who built up a regular client base, the money could accumulate. Some became quietly wealthy, not rich in the way a merchant or nobleman was rich, but comfortable. They might own their homes, small as they were, might have savings set aside, might be able to provide for their families better than many people working more respectable trades. But here's where the paradox deepens. That money, earned legitimately through hard and necessary labor, was sometimes literally untouchable to the broader society. There were taverns that refused to serve gong farmers, not because they couldn't pay, but because the proprietor didn't want their coin, didn't want money that had passed through those hands, that carried the association with that work. A gong farmer might walk into an establishment with money in his pocket, ready to pay for a drink or meal, and be turned away. Market vendors developed a practice that's almost difficult to believe, except that it's documented in contemporary accounts. When a gong farmer came to purchase something, food, cloth, whatever he needed, some vendors would use tongs to accept his payment. Metal tongs, like you might use to handle hot items or move things you didn't want to touch directly. They'd extend the tongs, the gong farmer would place his coins in them, and the vendor would transfer the money without their hands ever making contact. Think about what that means. The coins themselves weren't contaminated. Coins passed through countless hands in medieval commerce. But the association was so strong, the stigma so deep, that merely accepting payment directly from a gong farmer's hand was considered unacceptable. The vendor would rather use a tool, create physical distance, than risk the taint of contact. This happened even when the gong farmer had clearly washed, was wearing clean clothes, was presenting himself as respectably as possible. The occupation marked you in ways that couldn't be washed off. The money you earned couldn't buy you normal treatment. You could have a full purse and still be served with tongs, still be refused entry to establishments that would gladly take the coin of someone poorer but more respectable. For all the money they earned, gong farmers had no security beyond what they could save themselves. There were no pensions for this work, no retirement plans. If you became too old or too injured to descend into cesspits, you simply stopped earning. Whatever you'd managed to save was all you had. There was no health care in the modern sense, of course, not for anyone, but gong farmers faced particular risks that could end their working lives abruptly. A fall that damaged your back, a lung condition from years of breathing bad air, an injury sustained in a collapse. Any of these could mean you were finished with the work. And if you were finished with the work and you had no other trade, and no one would hire you for anything else because of who you'd been, what then? Life expectancy for Gong farmers was lower than average, though we don't have precise statistics. The work aged you. The constant exposure to toxic gases, to physical strain, to dangerous conditions, it took a toll. Men who did this work for 20 or 30 years were rare. Most either died in service or became unable to continue long before what we'd consider old age. And yet, despite earning good money, despite accumulating wealth that surpassed many of their social betters, respect never came. A Gong farmer could be the wealthiest man in his neighborhood and still be treated as an outcast. His money was good enough to be taken, with tongs, but not good enough to grant him social acceptance. There's a story that circulates in historical accounts, though it's hard to verify, of a Gong farmer who became quite wealthy over his career, who accumulated enough money to dress well, to present himself respectably when not working, who attempted to attend church alongside other parishioners, and who was asked to leave, not because he couldn't afford to be there, not because he was disruptive, but because the other congregants complained. His presence offended them. Even in a house of God, even in a community supposedly bound by Christian charity, the stigma of his profession excluded him. Whether that specific story is true or not, it represents a reality that many Gong farmers faced. Their money couldn't buy them integration, couldn't purchase acceptance, couldn't erase the mark of their profession. This created an odd economic situation. Here were workers earning solid wages, sometimes substantial wages, but with limited options for spending that money in ways that might improve their social standing. They couldn't use it to apprentice their sons to respectable trades. The guilds wouldn't accept them. They couldn't use it to marry their daughters to men from better families, who would consent to such a match. They couldn't even use it to gain normal social acceptance in daily commercial transactions. So what did they do with the money? Some saved it, perhaps hoping their grandchildren might escape the profession if enough wealth accumulated. Some spent it within their own community, on better tools, on their homes, on helping other outcasts. Some probably drank it away, because what else was there to do with money that couldn't buy you anything that mattered? The paradox was inescapable. The work was necessary. Cities couldn't function without it. The pay reflected that necessity, compensated for the difficulty and unpleasantness. But the workers remained outcasts, their money simultaneously valuable and tainted, accepted with reluctance and physical distance. A carpenter earning less might be welcomed in any tavern, might have vendors eager for his business, might have opportunities to advance socially or see his children enter better professions. A Gong farmer earning more had none of these things. His higher wages bought him survival, maybe even modest comfort, but never dignity, never respect, never acceptance. And there was no path out of this for most. The money you earned from the work marked you just as surely as the smell of it. People knew how you'd made your living, knew what you'd done to earn those coins, and that knowledge created barriers that no amount of money could breach. So the Gong farmers worked. They descended into the darkness and hauled up the waste and transported it through the streets and collected their payment. Good payment by the standards of the time. Payment that should have meant something, that did mean something, in purely economic terms. But in every other way that mattered in medieval society, in social standing, in respect, in the possibility of a better future for their children, the money was nearly worthless. They were well-paid outcasts, financially compensated for their essential labor, and completely excluded from the society they served. The work continued, the payments continued, the exclusion continued, and the paradox remained unresolved, generation after generation. Workers earning good money, living on the margins, their coin accepted with tongs, their presence tolerated only in darkness. This was the economic reality of the night soil trade, not poverty that,
for all their exclusion from society,
Gong farmers had something that might seem surprising: legal protection. Cities created ordinances specifically to protect them while they worked. If someone interfered with a gong farmer during his lawful night work, harassed him, blocked his access to a cesspit, prevented him from doing his job, that person could be fined. The penalties were real. The authorities took this seriously. Even more striking, assaults against gong farmers were punishable offenses. If someone attacked a nightman, whether physically or through theft of his tools or waste, yes, waste theft was apparently a concern, the attacker could face legal consequences. The law, for all that it didn't grant gong farmers social respect, did grant them a kind of practical protection. This reveals something important about how medieval authorities viewed the situation. They understood the necessity. They knew the city couldn't function without these workers, and so they created legal frameworks to ensure the work could continue, even if they couldn't or wouldn't create social frameworks for acceptance. There are court records showing that gong farmers could give testimony. Their word was admissible in legal proceedings. This wasn't universal for all low-status workers. Some occupations were considered so disreputable that their testimony was automatically suspect. But gong farmers, despite their social stigma, could speak in court and be heard. Their observations, their accounts of events, carried legal weight. Officials recognized, at least in practical terms, that these were skilled workers doing essential labor. Not respectable labor, certainly, but essential. And that essential quality granted them protections that pure social status would never have provided. The relationship between gong farmers and authority was complex in other ways too. We mentioned earlier that some became quietly wealthy. What happens when an outcast has money? Sometimes interesting things. There are records of gong farmers lending money to craftsmen, even to knights in some cases, members of the gentry who'd fallen on hard times and needed funds. The irony is exquisite. A knight, a member of the warrior class, borrowing money from a man who shoveled waste for a living. The knight who couldn't eat at the same table as the gong farmer, who wouldn't acknowledge him in daylight, who considered him fundamentally beneath notice. That knight taking his coin and promising repayment. The power dynamics in such a transaction are fascinating to consider. The gong farmer held the money, held the power to grant or refuse the loan. The knight needed something from someone he'd spent his whole life being trained to see as inferior. What was that conversation like? How was that negotiation conducted? The historical records don't give us those details. They simply note the transactions occurred. And then there was bribery. Some gong farmers, particularly those who'd accumulated substantial wealth, apparently bribed officials for various privileges, perhaps for favorable dumping rights, perhaps for exclusive access to certain areas of the city, perhaps simply for lighter enforcement of regulations that affected them. We know it happened because the practice is occasionally mentioned in civic documents, usually when someone was caught and punished. This too reveals something about their position. They had enough money to make bribes worth offering, and officials, despite the social stigma, were willing to take that money. The taint of association with gong farmers apparently didn't extend to their bribes. Money from waste collection was perfectly acceptable when it was flowing toward official pockets. The civic records of medieval cities contain fascinating juxtapositions. You'll find entries listing fines for bread that was underweight, a common offense, bakers shortchanging customers. And right beside those entries, sometimes, you'll find records of payments from gong farmers, lists of who was licensed to work, who'd paid their fees, who'd been granted permissions for particular routes or dumping grounds. The administrative mind that created these records apparently saw no irony in placing bread regulation and waste removal side by side. They were both matters of civic management, both necessary for urban function. The bread fed people, the waste removal kept them from getting sick. Different aspects of the same municipal responsibility. There were festivals occasionally where the city would celebrate itself, mark important occasions, thank various groups for their contributions, and sometimes, very carefully, very indirectly, there would be acknowledgement of the work that kept the city clean. Not naming the Gong farmers specifically usually, but thanking those who maintained the health of the city or protected the common good. Vague language that could include them while not explicitly mentioning them. It was recognition of a sort, grudging, indirect, unwilling to be too specific about what was being acknowledged, but it was there. The city knew, the authorities knew, everyone knew, really, even if they didn't want to say it plainly. Night after night, these men prevented urban collapse. That's not an exaggeration, it's simply what happened. The alternative to their labor wasn't just unpleasant, it was genuinely catastrophic. Without waste removal, disease would have spread unchecked. Water supplies would have been contaminated beyond use. The density of medieval urban living would have become impossible to sustain. Every morning that dawned on a medieval city where people could safely draw water from wells, where cesspits weren't overflowing into streets, where disease wasn't raging through the population, that was a morning made possible by the work done in darkness, by men standing waist-deep in filth, by the hidden infrastructure of the night soil economy. And yet, history remembers the work, if it remembers it all. Scholars studying medieval sanitation, urban development, public health, they understand the importance of waste management. They can describe the systems, explain the processes, discuss the regulations and economics. But the names, most are lost. Richard the Raker we know because he died and his death was recorded. A handful of others appear in court records, in payment ledgers, in occasional references. But the vast majority of men who did this work across centuries, their names are gone. They weren't considered important enough to record individually. They were functional, necessary, but not memorable. Their labor shaped the cities we still inhabit today. The medieval understanding of waste management, the systems they developed, the infrastructure they built, these influenced how cities grew, how they planned for sanitation, how they thought about the relationship between urban density and public health. That legacy persists, but the individuals, the actual men who descended into the darkness, who hauled up the waste, who made it all function, they're anonymous now. Categories rather than people. Gong farmers as a profession rather than John and Thomas and William and Robert doing a necessary job. There's something profoundly unfair about this. They were excluded from society and life, kept at a distance, stigmatized, marked as untouchable despite their essential contribution. And then in death, in historical memory, they're excluded again. Not through stigma this time, but through absence, through the simple fact that no one bothered to record their names, to preserve their stories, to remember them as individuals. The work was seen, the work was acknowledged, at least functionally. The work was protected by law and compensated with money. But the workers themselves, in life and in historical memory, remained in shadow. This is the final paradox of the night soil economy. It was absolutely critical to urban civilization. Everyone depended on it. And yet the people who made it function were systematically excluded, forgotten, erased from the record. We can reconstruct what they did. We can understand the systems they worked within.
We can appreciate the difficulty and danger and skill involved. We can recognize their contribution as foundational to urban life. But we can't, for the most part, know who they were, can't hear their voices, can't know their individual stories, their hopes, their thoughts about the work they did and the lives they led. They prevented collapse nightly. They made civilization possible literally, and history gave them anonymity in return. Perhaps there's a kind of poetry in that. The work done in darkness by people who lived in shadow, remembered now in the vaguest of terms, essential but invisible, critical but forgotten, the foundation that no one wanted to acknowledge, that everyone depended upon. The medieval